There are few topics that encourage a more strong reaction on both sides of the equation than climate change. I, for one, have questioned my own beliefs about climate change because there are so many people who are so adamant that it is real. There is a smaller number of people, I believe, who think that it is not real. Well, here to sort it out is a friend of mine, Guy Mitchell. He has written a book called The Great Deception. Guy, welcome to The Truth. It sounds like you and Donald Trump are on the same page because he calls it the Great Green Energy Scam, I believe is
Yeah.
his code word. Help us sort of, you have written a book, The Great Deception. As I understand it, you spent 4 years writing the book, and you're obviously a very smart person. You've got a BS degree from Alabama with a concentration in mechanical engineering. You have worked in the industry. You have your own company that is very successful. And you also completed the advanced management program at Harvard Business School in 1989. So I think that you certainly have the mental capacity to give us a well reasoned argument why you don't believe that climate change is real. Tell us where you're coming from.
Thank you, John. I appreciate being on your program.
Good to have you.
Um, my conclusion about and I refer to it as a fraudulent global warming hypothesis, resulted from, as you mentioned, I spent more than 4 years researching the subject, studying the measured in thermodynamics, but I also took about a year out to study spectroscopy and quantum mechanics as it relates to the subject matter. So when I looked at the facts, the scientific evidence about the claims of man-made global warming, which morphed into climate change several years ago after the proponents had a hard time substantiating the fact that the Earth's temperature was warming, it became apparent to me that that the claim was motivated by other than science. There are three there are three world databases that deal with the temperature of the landmass. There's the Hadley Climate Research Unit in England. There's another outfit in California, and then the University of Alabama Huntsville maintains probably the most accurate, in my opinion, temperature of the troposphere, which is the first 8 or 9 miles of the atmosphere. And then NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, maintains a database on the landmass and the world's oceans. And the interesting thing about it is when you look at the data, you look at the temperatures, they clearly demonstrate that there hasn't been a warming of the landmass, of the troposphere, or the first 10 or 12 kilometers of the atmosphere, or the ocean. So the facts don't back up the claim. And to make make matters worse, there's no the Earth has no average temperature. And so there's a great, on my website, which is www.globalwarmingdeception.com, I have a number of scientific research papers to which I refer in the writing of my book. And one of them is by some scientists in the in the Journal of Non-Equilibrium Thermodynamics, which if you read a little bit of that, it'll put you to sleep at night. But the point they make is the Earth has no average temperature. You can't, the concept, first of all, temperature is a proxy for the kinetic energy of the molecules in a system. So as you sit in your studio today, you have three basic gases. You have uh, nitrogen, which composes about 78% of the atmosphere, oxygen about 21%, and then argon about 9. So what temperature demonstrates is the speed, if you will, with which the molecules move around uh, in your studio. And so the idea that the temperature of your studio could affect the temperature of a studio in Washington, D.C. or in Moscow, Russia, is a is a is fallacious reasoning. You can't add temperatures and come up with an average temperature. That's the first and probably most fatal presumption in the global warming hypothesis.
But now, Guy, I have seen charts that show that the temperature. Um, I don't know how they collect the data, and I'm sure it can be finagled, but I've seen a graph where the temperature of the Earth was flatlined all the way up through, say, 1930, and then it started to trend upward, and in the last 20 years, it has trended further upward, and it looks like it has increased about 1 degree in the last 30 years, which is a pretty rapid acceleration. But you're saying you don't believe that you don't believe that those numbers, not that they're wrong, but they don't even exist, if I've heard you
Well,
correctly.
it's, you know, as I say in my book, the concept of an average temperature of the Earth is a figment of the climate scientist's imagination conjured up in an effort to try to prove a false hypothesis. If you look at, let's take the graph to which you refer, which is prepared from NOAA data.
Yes.
Now, what NOAA does is they have what are called metropolitan statistical area temperature stations, MSATs. And these MSATs are surveyed by volunteers throughout the world, and particularly in the United States. And they go and they take, they observe the data reading twice a day. And then what NOAA does is they average them and come up with an average temperature. Well, here's the problem. These volunteers go to assay these MSAT stations at various times of the day. And what NOAA does is they adjust that temperature reading. If you're one of the volunteers and you go at, let's say, 10 o'clock, and you take the temperature indicated by the thermometer at the MSAT station at 10 o'clock, when the climate analyst gets that, they adjust that because they say, well, that's not really the high for the day. The high is going to occur at 2 p.m. or 1 p.m. So they add data. And I show in my book how they add data. They add temperature. They adjust the temperature, maximum and minimum temperatures for all of the MSATs data. And that's called the time of day observation. Then they have another adjustment called the homogenization adjustment, where if they take the data from three stations and they don't, and the one in the middle doesn't agree with the other two, they adjust it to bring it into a range of acceptability. And the thing in science, one does not adjust observations. That would be just like in 1919 when the team that went down to West Principe, Africa, to observe the solar eclipse and try to confirm or refute Einstein's general theory of relativity, which said that light was bent by, like about 0.8 arc seconds. The guy that went down there to do it is a famous physicist from England. He took the photographic plates and he uh, captured the amount that light was bent, and it agreed with Einstein's calculations under the general theory of relativity. But they didn't try to adjust the data if it had, because he happened to believe that the theory was correct. So the idea that NOAA would adjust the land temperature data, it accounts for more warming. When you read my book, you'll see the graphs I prepared in there based on these adjustments that demonstrate that they've added more warming to this quote unquote database than than they've claimed in the global warming of 1 degree Fahrenheit or whatever it is.
So, how do you do you believe that the water levels are rising, at least in the Atlantic Ocean and along the east coast of the United States? Would you concede that?
No, if you read Steve Koonin, who is a PhD physicist from Caltech, wrote a book called Unsettled. And what Steve Koonin did was he took empirical data. He looked at the historical empirical data, which is publicly available, on the severity of hurricanes, the severity of droughts, the severity of floods, sea level rise. All of the other empirical data is observational data. It's not like the data I quote in my book, which is calculated and measured data. But empirical data looks at all those issues, the things, the observational data that people try to quote to justify the claim. And Coonan demonstrated in every one of them that there hasn't been a sea level rise, and he shows all the publicly available data. The severity of hurricanes has dropped over the last 100 years. The number of floods, the whole nine yards. So it's all just an effort to make claims that are not substantiated by good science.
So, I take it that you did not like Inconvenient Truth that Al Gore produced some 15 or 20 years ago.
You know, I wrote extensively in my book about Al Gore and his participation in this fraud. And the reason I call it a fraud is this: the climate scientists at the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change know that the models that they've developed, which are pseudoscience, cannot predict global warming, and yet and if you look at there was this scandal at the Hadley Climate Research Center, had the HADCRU Center back in England about 10 years ago, when the emails of all the climate scientists were hacked, and they admitted to, and this is in my book as well, they admitted to adjusting and biasing the data and covering up data which would refute the whole global warming hypothesis. So these scientists that are knowledgeable, either as a lawyer would say, they either know or they should know that these claims are bogus, and the reason they continue to be promoted by Al Gore, John Kerry, Antonio Guterres, who's the Secretary General of the UN, Klaus Schwab, who is the head of the World Economic Forum, and global investment firms. It's all about the money.
Yeah.
There's over $1 trillion that's been spent on climate research, quote unquote, with nothing to show for it. None of these models can accurately predict what they measure, and what they measure is pseudoscience. The Earth has no average temperature. I mean, you can't add the temperature of Miami to the temperature of Moscow, and come up with a meaningful number, because the molecules in Miami can have no effect on the molecule, just like the molecules in your room. If it was warm and you turned on the air conditioner, and now those molecules are not moving as rapidly as they were when the temperature was warmer, they're not transferring thermal energy to the molecules on your skin, and so you do not feel as warm. So there's just no science in it. And when I started this project, I had no intention of writing. I mean, my interest is in theoretical physics, and particularly particle physics, and trying to understand what causes gravity. So that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years is following the research that's done at the Large Hadron Collider with CERN on the Franco-Swiss border. So I just happened into this by chance, and the only reason that I wrote the book was that I could not believe the level of disingenuous presentation of facts and I mean, just the effort to hoodwink the public. It was shocking. And it wouldn't be so bad if it weren't that it could have, if it weren't for President Trump, it could have had, it'll still have some impact on our power grid because we're going to have problems with it, but it could have had a devastating effect on our economy like it is in Western Europe. See, in Western Europe, they bought this thing 30 years ago. They shut down the nuclear power plants, which emit nothing but heat and water vapor. And they shut down all of the coal-fired power plants and abandoned 79 billion metric tons of domestic coal reserves in the EU. And now they're wholly dependent upon the world market price for gas. And they have manufacturers leaving the EU in droves. And the manufacturing GDP of the EU is cratered, and it's going to be difficult. It's going to take decades for them to recover.
Amazing. So how? I mean, just anecdotally, you watch pictures of icebergs collapsing into the Arctic, and then like where I live, FEMA has passed a rule that you have to bring your lot up to a 7 foot MSL elevation to build a new house. West Palm Beach has taken that 7 feet and upped it to 2 more feet to 9 feet, even to build a new house because of the rising waters. And but you seemingly discount and don't believe any of that. The basis for them doing that.
Yeah, no, I'll tell you the basis for them doing it. First of all, you know, the risk for as you know, I live here in Vero Beach on the eastern coast of Florida, and the risk for flooding is related to hurricanes and the contemporaneous effect of a high tide when a hurricane comes through and the storm surge that results. But the mean sea level hasn't risen. You know, what has risen is the insurance company's desire to influence the state legislature in Florida and other places to increase. We're under the same dictates you are. We have to have the elevation of the lowest level of my house here in Vero Beach has to be 8 feet above mean sea level. But mean sea level hasn't changed. What has changed is the insurance company's desires to try to eliminate any losses that may result from storm surge. It has nothing to do at all with mean sea level rise.
Well, that's an interesting analysis, and it has the ring of truth to it. So, what do you think about internal combustion engines and their dependence on fossil fuel? I've happened to have raised my family and moved to Atlanta when I was in my 20s, and I'd never had allergies before. Atlanta's air is horribly polluted. We didn't really realize how bad the pollution is until we had COVID and people stopped driving. And after about 3 days, you'd go outside and the sky was crystal clear blue. Now, is there an argument to be made about dealing with pollution that comes from car emissions?
Sure. And I think it's important to differentiate. I've done over 100 interviews and video interviews. I mean, from Lima, Peru to London, England to Australia. And I'm always asked a question similar to this. And my answer is there's a difference between pollution and global warming. You know, pollution is the addition of, gases or particulate into the atmosphere at concentrations that are problematic from a health standpoint. And so people say, well, I guess if you don't believe global warming exists, then you're an opponent of electrical vehicles. I say, not at all. You know, in fact, I did my senior project in undergraduate school on comparing a reciprocating piston engine, a internal combustion engine like you're talking about, with a rotary engine, a Wankel engine that was in a Toyota. And so I think electric vehicles are great particularly for uh, urban areas like LA or someplace, uh, New York, where there's a high concentration per capita of people, and clearly the emissions of NOx and unburned uh, fuels are problematic for respiratory health. So, but that's different from the proposal that a CO2 molecule absorbs, and I'd like to get into a little bit of the science on this, a long wave infrared photons emitted by the Earth's surface and heats the Earth up. That is fallacious reasoning. There's no basis in science to, you know, accept that. We used to have a house in Cuernavaca, Mexico for 40 years. Used to fly down to Mexico City and then go to Cuernavaca, which is about 80 kilometers southwest.
There's some
Mexico
good
City,
tarpon fishing in Cuernavaca.
is that right?
Yeah, I've been there to tarpon fish.
Well, I mean, the pollution in Mexico City in the 70s and 80s was awful, and the Mexican government, to their credit, addressed it. They cleaned up the emissions of automobiles, primarily using catalytic converters, and got some older vehicles off it. And now the birds have come back to Mexico City. So, yeah, to say that the pollution from internal combustion engines, to the extent that there's incomplete combustion and you have NOx and you have carbon dioxide, is problematic. And the U.S. has done a lot to clean that up. But it has nothing, the emissions of automobiles, everything else being constant, don't have anything to do with the claims of global warming. So here's the claim that the proponents of the fraudulent science will tell you. What happens is, as man burns fossil fuels or wood, well, I guess wood's a fossil fuel, but as we burn fossil fuels and carbon dioxide is emitted into the atmosphere, it goes up and it stays in the atmosphere. And I've read some ridiculous resident times, but it's only about 0.4% of the atmosphere in the United States. You know, water vapor is about 4%, and carbon dioxide is about 0.4. So, but the hypothesis is the CO2 molecules are resident in the lower troposphere, and they absorb a long wave infrared photon, which is, I mean, light is what photons are in the electromagnetic spectrum. They absorb it, they trap it, and then they emit it to the Earth's surface and cause global warming. Well, first of all, the absorption spectrum, and I go into this in a lot of detail in my book to try to educate the reader. The absorption spectrum of a CO2 molecule in the atmosphere is a very narrow range. It's right around 15 micron wavelength. And when you look at, you calculate using Planck's law, you can calculate the energy that it absorbs, and it has to emit the same wavelength in order to obey the laws of quantum mechanics. So when you calculate the heat flux that results from the increase of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere coming back to Earth, it's about 2 watts per meter squared. Now remember that number, because 2 watts per meter squared is about 0.2% of the sun's irradiance on a clear summer's day at equatorial latitudes of about 1,000 watts per meter squared. So you got CO2 sending back 2 watts per meter squared, which is a de minimis amount of heat flux. And when it hits the landmass, it's quickly dissipated by convection. The wind blows across the surface of the Earth and cools it, and that's it. Now, but here's the interesting thing. The world's oceans cover 71% of the surface of the ocean. See, a 15 micron wavelength photon, and this has been proven by, and I cite the research that proves this in spectrographic analysis. That's the analysis of the absorption and emission of electromagnetic radiation. A 15 micron wavelength photon emitted by CO2 in the atmosphere can't penetrate the surface of the world's oceans to a depth greater than 100 microns, which is about the diameter of a human hair. So it can have no effect on the temperature of the world's oceans, which cover 71% of the surface. So, I mean, you can just intuitively understand that there's no way that the CO2 emissions could have any effect on the Earth's temperature, and that's science. And you don't read that in any of the UNIPCC reports, but those are the facts.
That is an amazing statistic and one that I had not heard before. And I did misspeak, by the way. I've been to Campeche to tarpon fish. I went to a wedding in Cuernavaca, which is
Okay.
obviously inland. There's no tarpon fishing
No,
in
Cuernavaca.
Cuernavaca. And you were so nice not to call me out on that.
Well, John,
does not go
you're so
unnoted.
knowledgeable about so many areas. I didn't want to contradict you on such a small issue.
Well, we're talking about much more important things here. But that truly is a remarkable statistic when you think about the 71% of the Earth's total mass cannot be warm beyond 1 micron. I mean, I'd never heard that before.
Yep.
And that one data point has moved me even closer to your side of the equation, which, by the way, I was already on. And you and I see EVs and pollution identically, and people do seem to mistakenly confuse that with climate change. And there's really little overlap when you think about it. But the one thing I would add, you said in urban areas, I happen to have a Tesla. I don't want to get us off too far off course here, but my listeners know that I'm a devoted Musk fanboy and Tesla aficionado. It's simply a better mousetrap. And the range is a little bit limited today. But, you know, when I first picked up a telephone, other people were talking on the line. It was called a party line. There wasn't any dialer on it. So give science a chance to catch up with the demand. But, you know, nothing triggers me like being lied to. And what you're describing, Guy, is a hoax. That's why President Trump calls it the new, or the, what does he call it? The green new scam.
Green new scam.
Yeah, and that's what it is. It feels like we are being lied to by epic proportions. So, in your book, you acknowledge that 95% of the world's scientists believe in climate change or espouse that. I believe that's what you write. How do they get that number of people to go along with a hoax?
John, I actually do not. When you read my book, I first address the issue of where this quote unquote study came from, and it was from a group of global warming proponents who analyzed some climate research papers, and I won't get into all the details, but they absolutely perverted the data and came up with 97% of the world's scientists do not believe in global warming. When you read their report, they looked at 11,977 scientific papers, and they didn't qualify them as to whether they were directly addressed to global warming. But what they did was they sent out a survey to the authors of these papers and said, in essence, do you believe man has caused global warming? Out of 11,977, I'm pretty close on that. I memorized it or wrote about it so many times. 66% didn't respond. 66% of those that were surveyed, and this is in their published letter. It's called a citizen science letter. It's not a research paper. But in this letter, they say 66% of those we surveyed didn't respond. 33% responded, and 32% said they believed in that man had caused global warming. So what they did was they divided 32 by 33 and came up with 97 and disregarded the 66% of the people who did not respond to the survey.
Well, I'll tell you what I see as the problem with all of that. When Biden came into office, the first thing he did, one of the first executive orders he made was to kill the Keystone Pipeline.
Yep.
I was in a bar, which I unfortunately visit periodically, and I
Find
was
yourself
standing
in.
I was standing next to a gentleman, and we started up a conversation, and he told me that he had worked in the oil and gas industry at Occidental Petroleum for like 35 years. And that the week before, by virtue of Biden canceling the Keystone Pipeline, he was laid off permanently from his job. So these issues have monumental repercussions for many, many, many people. Can you imagine that the people that you mentioned, like John Kerry and Al Gore and Klaus Schwab, that guy, you know, he reminds me of Jim Baker. You remember Jim Baker? I'd be channel surfing, I'd land on him and Tammy Faye, and I would just linger there so I could dislike him. That's what I do with Klaus Schwab. He just sparks a very negative reaction in me. But can you imagine being so selfish and so greedy that you would cause literally tens of thousands of people to lose their jobs solely in order to get your way? But what is the flip side of it? If it's not fossil fuel, if it's not nuclear power or coal, then where's the angle? Where are they going to make their money from?
Several different ways. First of all, in 1997, I'm trying to remember the dates, but I'm going to be pretty close. Maybe it was 98. Al Gore was instrumental in promoting what was called the Kyoto Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol, which was a product of the UN climate change group, established the concept of carbon credits. And it went like this, that if you, each of the signers of the Kyoto Protocol, each country, and by the way, to his credit, President Bill Clinton never did submit the Kyoto Protocol, the treaty, to the Senate, and it was never ratified by the U.S. But all of those that were signers of that treaty agreed to accept a target of reducing CO2 emissions back to, I think the base was 1990. It's in my book. But and so as they went along, they reported about them, and if your country or if your company was going to exceed the limit assigned to you, you could buy a carbon credit, and it was a theoretical offset that maybe what you were doing is carbon credits were assigned for say a forest in Brazil or a forest, they had a theoretical tie to a carbon sink. A carbon sink absorbs carbon dioxide. The biggest carbon sink in the world is the ocean, and that's one of the reasons that you can't, you don't need to worry about CO2. But anyway, so they got this idea and they started trading carbon credits. Well, back then, when it first started in 2004, 5 years later, Al Gore and a partner from Goldman Sachs formed a company in London called Generation Investment Management. And they began to trade, not subject to SEC regulation, they began to trade these carbon credits. Well, what happened was, in the Kyoto Protocol ran from the early 2000s to about 2012, and it fell apart when Canada withdrew because they were going to have to pay around 11 or 12 billion dollars of penalties for exceeding their allocations over that period of time. And Canada said, we're out of here. So the Kyoto Protocol fell apart. During that time, carbon dioxide emissions worldwide increased by 32%, primarily the result of the Chinese and the Indians and the Indonesians and some other developing countries. So then the Paris Climate Accord was the second effort to try to reduce worldwide carbon emissions. And of course, that was, Mr. Obama enrolled the U.S. in the Paris Climate Accord. President Trump pulled us out. President Biden put us back in. And during that period of time, CO2 emissions have continued to rise. And it shouldn't surprise anybody because China in 2021, this is all in my book, I may be off a year, built 97% of all the new power plants, coal-fired power plants built in the world. And so, China, India, the signers of the Paris Climate Accord paid Indonesia $20 billion during President Biden's administration to try to persuade them to wean their generation of power using coal. And they turned around and built several new coal-fired power plants with the money we gave them. So, but what happens is, to directly answer your question, you've got these green new investments in these emerging countries where investment banks, and they've all backed off of it now, but people like Blackstone, Vanguard, and others would go in and they would assemble ESG investment vehicles. People, maybe if you're a third or fourth generation Rockefeller and you feel guilty about John D. developing the oil industry, you'll take some of the money you've inherited and put it in these ESG investments, environmental, social, and governmental. And so they'll go over and they'll theoretically going to build these green power systems in countries to try to persuade them not to build coal-fired power plants. And so, the investment banks are putting together billions and trillions of dollars of investment portfolios to support this. They obviously get a fee to put the deal together, and then they get a rake on the the amount of interest that it pays. And then you have these selling of selling the carbon credit. I'm trying to remember, it's all in my book, but I mean the carbon credit market in the early 2000s was, I'll say, 10 or 12 billion, and then it went to 800 billion over about a 10 or 15 year period. So it's blossomed, and all people like Al Gore and all the other people that trade these carbon credits, it's a commodity. So it'd be like if you're selling wheat or corn or something, they're just raking it in.
And it's an invention. It's a fictitious invention.
I mean, the idea of what you're doing. I mean, in certain cases, you may be buying. If you're, I'll tell you a great example, and I wrote about this in one of my op-eds. Let's say that you're the chairman of Nucor Steel, and BlackRock, which at one time was one of the top three owners of 80% of the S&P 500. So let's just say the chairman of BlackRock comes to you and you're the chairman of Nucor Steel, and he says, you need to reduce your carbon footprint. And you're the chairman of Nucor, and you take him and come to the window and you look out at the steel plant that's behind you and you say, Larry, See that out there? That's a fixed investment. I can't change the carbon footprint. We're making steel out there. And he said, well, I understand that, but one thing you could do is you could buy carbon credits to offset your emissions of carbon dioxide. And you say, well, what do those carbon credits do? And he said, well, you're an invest you're keeping trees from being cut down in the Amazon rainforest, and those trees are going to absorb CO2, which every living plant matter does, and it makes oxygen, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're going to be okay. And you say, well, you know what? I'm not going to emit any less CO2. And you say, well, but you know, you're going to be much more responsible citizen of the planet in terms of balancing your emissions with offsets. It's a racket.
You have given us an eye opener today, Guy, and I'm so grateful to you for that. So, in the minutes that we've got remaining, let me just ask you real quick your position on nuclear power. Why has Germany shut down their multi-million dollar investment in nuclear power plants? That's one thing that just makes no sense to me.
John, it makes no sense at all. You know, the French, uh, and I did a lot of reading and research in the preparation for this book. And one thing that was interesting is in the early 70s, when the Arab states first, put the oil embargo in place, whoever the British Prime Minister was said, we're gonna convert to nuclear power. And over the ensuing period now, about 85% of the power in France is generated or more is generated with nuclear power, and they actually export power to the EU, and that net they earn about 3.5 billion euros. So this whole thing, if you remember the 3 Mile Island
Sure.
accident,
Yeah.
and no one was killed in that accident, by the way, no one was injured. But the result is that the U.S. has taken this draconian position, as have the Germans. I mean, Germany gave us, people like Max Planck and Albert Einstein and some of the greatest scientists in the world, and they shipped these nuclear power. I mean, Uganda operates a nuclear power plant. I mean, a lot of African nations do. If they can operate them without melting the reactor down, it is the dumbest thing the United States has done to adversely affect our power grid. And by the way, the problem now is you have a Western grid, an Eastern grid, and ERCOT, which is the Texas grid. Texans tend to be independent. You have three grids that are interconnected. Well, California has to import. I'm trying to remember, it's again all in my book, but they import about 25% of the power they consume. They get it from nearby states. And there are a lot of parts of the grid that are importing power from these regional operators. They control the grid, they're all interlocked. But the bottom line is we're now in a supply production deficit. And I wrote an op-ed, it's on my website, about when the TVA system went down and put 500,000 of their customers in the dark in freezing weather over Christmas. It's a serious concern, and that's what I refer. If it were just a flawed hypothesis, Claudius told him, he said, I think that the solar system revolves around the Earth. Well, that was flawed for 1,400 years, but he didn't. It wasn't fraudulent. But this has the potential. President Trump saved us. It had potential to just devastate our economy like it's doing the EU today.
So an alternative energy source that has always resonated with me is solar power. It consumes a non-depletable resource for power. I'm just flabbergasted that now, after 50 years, solar has not caught on more than I would have expected. What's your take on it?
Well, solar power and wind power have a place, but a minor place in the power grid, and here's why. They're both called asynchronous generators. Solar voltaic cells, as well as wind turbines, have to have that, the power of the speed at which the wind blows and the nature of the electrons that excite a solar voltaic cell uh, have to have what's called an inverter. If you go into a fossil fuel plant or a nuclear plant simply heats water with a nuclear reaction, and in a fossil fuel plant, you're heating the water with burning coal. But what happens is that these plants produce uh, uh, via the turbine generator, 60 cycle, 60 hertz power, which can go directly into the power grid and right into your home, and it powers your refrigerator motor and all the other stuff, your lights, everything like that. The alternative energy sources like solar voltaic cells or wind turbines have to have an inverter to convert them from DC to AC current. And so that's not a real big deal, except when the wind blows, you don't have uh, wind power. And when the clouds obscure the sun, it cuts back a lot on the power that's generated. But here's the thing. Neither of these generators can start the power grid if you have a blackout. They don't have what's called inertia. When you have, if you've ever been, I worked in a power plant for 3 years, and if you have a turbine generator that's off the line and you're getting ready to bring it on, you have to bring it up to speed, 3,600 RPM, so that it generates 60 hertz, 60 cycles per second of electricity. But then you got to lock it into the grid. And when you do that, it has to be synchronized, or else you'll have a mechanical problem with the turbine shaft. But the point of all this is that when the power goes out, you don't go around your house and turn off all your lights. You don't go around your house and unplug your refrigerator, or any other appliance that's pulling power. But the minute the power plant gets connected to the load, there's a huge draw. And so the inertia of the generating system, if you've got a big mass of your turbine generator spinning like that, it can handle the draw. It's not a voltage drop per se, but it can handle the drag on the generating system. But you can't black start a system with solar and wind power.
Guy Mitchell, he is the author of The Great Deception. If I had any question about whether global warming was a hoax before I talked to Guy, I certainly don't now. I think President Trump and Guy Mitchell are right. It is the Green New Scam. And it's been such a pleasure having you on the show today. I have learned some new vocabulary words. I have learned how little I know about the world and the science, and has piqued my interest. So I'm enjoying reading the book. I'm going to rush to finish it now, and it's certainly been a pleasure. People can find you at www.globalwarmingdeception.com, and we'll put it in the notes and on our banner there so people can see it. And what's your next act, Guy? What are you working on now?
Getting ready to put out a second edition. And the second edition, if you go to my website, John, after the book was published, and it's self-published, and so I've had to, manage it, which was a new experience for me. I'd never written a book before, so, but I'm putting out a second edition where I'm going to incorporate at least a dozen op-ed articles that I've written that are on the website in the news page that deal with things like, will the EU devolve into third world countries because of their power grid problems? I explain in detail about the economic motivation for investment banks and Al Gore and people, the UN. And so I'm going to put out a second edition, probably be out late this spring, where we're going to put in about 15 of these op-eds that have been published in the American Thinker and the Western Journal and Epoch Times. And I never could get one in the Wall Street Journal. They didn't want to hear the alternative narrative, I guess.
Well, it is amazing to me. You know, I've got quite a few friends that tend to be liberal, and I've noticed that a consistent common thread is that they will make their little dig, and then no sooner than I start to respond, they'll say, "Oh, we shouldn't talk about this. It's not good for our relationship."
Yeah.
And that is a common phenomenon I've noticed. I'm going to try and find somebody that is a climate believer and
Sure.
have them come on and invite you back, and we'll have a healthy discussion.
Love to
I'm
do that.
A, I'm not qualified to do it myself. B, I skew towards your beliefs because I do think that it, as you have very intellectually outlined, I do believe that it's a scam and a hoax, and I think our listeners, I know, believe that it's a scam and a hoax. I come on and talk about a Tesla and electric car, and I lose all my fans, all my friends, because they think I'm a climate believer. And the fact of the matter is, I just think it's a better mousetrap. I was disappointed to hear that when we went into that's a question you frequently got. I thought I had just invented the notion of the difference between being a conservationist and a climate believer. So,
Yeah.
Guy Mitchell, thank you for coming on. We could look forward to having you back, and good to see you.
Thank you, John.